Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world from the IATEFL Young Learners and Teen SIG. I'm Bruno Andrade, Public Relations Coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome Jamie Keddie, who's our April webinar speaker. Jamie is a teacher trainer and a storyteller. He's the founder of Lesson Stream and the author of Images by Oxford University Press 2009, bringing online video into the classroom by the same publishing house in 2014, and Video Telling by Lesson Stream Books 2017. Jamie is an associate teacher at Norwich Institute for Language Education, and he also sends out a weekly story post that you can subscribe to at jamiekeddie.com, and they are awesome lesson plans that you can use in your classroom. And besides all that, Jamie is a very dear friend of mine, so it's a great pleasure to have you here, Jamie. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bruno. You're a gentleman for saying such nice things. Can everybody hear me? It's always nice to start just by doing a quick sound check and making sure that you can. Excellent. I'm going to take off my earphones because I have a little bit of an echo. So I've been following where you're from, and we've got a bit of as usual, people from all over the place. I'm just down the road from Bruno. Bruno's up in Rio, and I'm in Sao Paulo at the moment, and both in Brazil. So it's 8 o'clock for me. Is it 8 o'clock for you too, Bruno? 8 o'clock on a Saturday. And so thank you very much for coming here and being here and spending this next hour. What we're going to do is, rather than have this format where I do a webinar for 40 minutes and then invite you to ask questions, we're going to make it interactive all the way through from beginning to end. So what I like to do here is I like to while I do my thing, I like to keep an eye on the chat. All right. So just chat, type in the chat. The first thing to ask is anyone working today after this webinar, before this webinar, or during this webinar? Is anyone working? Because some people do work on Saturdays. So a few people working. In Brazil, it's a holiday, isn't it, Bruno? But no holiday for us, because I've got a very full day of work.
Not today. Holiday is on Monday.
Monday, is it? And so I'm going to assume that most of you are teachers of teenagers. Is that right? Type in who you teach. Anna Maria, indeed. So my experience as a teacher is teenagers and adults mostly, or adults and teenagers. And there's sometimes quite a lot of they have quite a lot in common. Sometimes adults behave like teenagers, don't they? So yes, my second question, has anyone here ever dropped their mobile phone down the toilet? Or has anyone ever dropped their mobile phone in a river or in the sea? Has anyone ever had their mobile phone stolen? And if you had your mobile phone stolen, did you know that it was stolen at the time, or was it not until later when you discovered it had been stolen? A few weeks ago, Atika. So more people have had their mobile phones stolen than have dropped their mobile phones down the toilet or into the sea. As far as I can see, no one's ever dropped their mobile phone in the sea. Is that right? Has anyone ever cracked the screen of their mobile phone? A few people have. You know, I've done a lot of things in my life, but I have never cracked the screen of my mobile phone. And it's not that I'm particularly careful either. Has anyone ever found a mobile phone and managed to get in touch with the owner? Last week, Elizabeth, Now, I'm not going to ask you to elaborate here, but every one of those yeses to all of those questions that I've just asked there is a story. Um, when I said, have you found a phone? And Elizabeth said, yes, that's a story. And if this was a classroom context, there's a story there waiting to be told, isn't there? And the reason I ask this is because, well, most people seem to be, or teenagers in any case, seem to take a lot of pride in their mobile phones, don't they? Their mobile phone is possibly the most important object in their lives. In fact, one of my friends said the other day that her little boy, he never cries. He never cries. He never cries, except for that one time when he lost his mobile phone, then he cried. And for me, my most important object isn't actually my mobile phone, it's my laptop computer, my MacBook Pro. For me, my MacBook Pro is much more important than my mobile phone. Here's my mobile phone here. But the problem is that I had an accident and I'm not doing this webinar from my MacBook computer. I'm doing it from somebody else's. Can you guess what happened to my MacBook Pro computer, which has broken my heart? That's not a broken heart, is it? That's a heart. That's a broken heart. Now, if you're in a classroom, this is, I mean, the yes and no question game is one of the best. It's one of my favourites. So, dropped it in a toilet. Now, that's an interesting idea to drop your MacBook Pro in a toilet, and that would be an interesting question to ask people. I wonder if anyone's ever dropped their MacBook Pro in a toilet, and I'm sure it's happened sometimes, but would you agree with me? It's much more common to drop your mobile phone in the toilet than your MacBook Pro. Um, Elizabeth, it was stolen. Now, I am incredibly careful with my things. I tend not to have things stolen. I've never had the phone stolen, never had I once had my wallet stolen in the street in Barcelona, and I chased the guy, and as we were chasing, as this chase was going down the streets of Barcelona, he opened the wallet, took out the money, which was only €10, and then threw the wallet in the air. So I had to go and chase the wallet rather than chase him, and he got away. Oh, but I don't know if you can say that I've ever had my wallet stolen. I'm really, really careful when I take my rucksack out with me. And even if I take my rucksack with me, it's got my MacBook Pro in it, and I'm at the hairdresser's. The hairdresser always wants to put it on a hook or put it out of the way, and I always say, no, I have to keep my rucksack strapped over my knees, so one strap over my right knee and one strap over my left knee. And people think I'm crazy, but it's only because I'm extra safe. What do you think about that? So Nabila, I would never forget my MacBook Pro. It's like my head. Losing my MacBook Pro, forgetting my rucksack, it'd be like forgetting my head. Um, so what else we said? Someone poured water on it. Bruno's idea was someone poured water on it. That's getting closer. Um, Somebody said spilled a drink in it. Elisa, you were the first person to suggest a scenario here, and I didn't see you. Otherwise, actually, you know what? I did see it. I deliberately ignored it because I wanted to entertain the other ideas first. That's a little trick there. If you'd been my student in the class and you'd said, someone spilled a drink and I would have said, that's a very interesting question, Eliza. What kind of drink, for example? And I would have asked you to suggest some things. But then I would have said, any other ideas? Without having said yes or no to you. This is what happened. This is what happened. I like working in cafes. It's something I do. When I say I like working in cafes, I don't mean that I'm a waiter. You know that. What I mean is I like to set myself up with my MacBook Pro in a cafe, and I've always had a fear, because I'm very, very careful, but I've always had a fear that one day there could be a cup of coffee spilt on my MacBook Pro. And I'm always really, really nervous when waiters, for example, pass by with cups of coffee, or occasionally if you've a waiter serve you coffee and pass the coffee over the MacBook Pro. I'm always, ooh. Well, guess who spilled the coffee in the MacBook Pro? And it wasn't just an espresso, it was a full cup of milky cappuccino. And it wasn't a cat, it was me. I don't know how it happened, I just knocked it, and the whole thing just flowed right across my keyboard like lava moving its way through rocks. It was, I was, I was quick. That's what I was. My reactions were quick as a flash. And I'm very lucky because there was on the table there was a bowl full of napkins. And I just grabbed the napkins, wiped the whole thing. I then immediately got online, typed in spilt coffee MacBook Pro to find out what people would suggest. It took me about 10 minutes to learn that the very, very first thing you should do is not look up what you should do on what do you think the first thing you should do if you spill coffee in your MacBook Pro? You wipe it off. That's the first thing you do. What's the second thing you do? What would you do? What's the second thing you should do? Exactly. You turn it off. You switch it off. Not me. I get online to find out what you should do, and it took me 10 minutes to discover that the very first thing you should do is switch it off. But I did think, with all this search engine optimization, if you wanted to have the best the best advice for people to spill coffee, you might have come out with a better blog post than some of the ones I saw. Nadia, turn the keyboard face down, run home and get an air blower to dry it off. These are all great ideas, but I think that I managed to get it turned off in time. Here, I managed also to take a couple of photos. This is dedication. I knew I was going to be doing this webinar today, and despite my anxiety, I managed to take a couple of photographs. Here's the scene of the crime. Isn't that sad? Can you see that? Does that not look like a sort of murder scene? Isn't that awful? It is from a different angle. If you photograph crime scenes, you always have to take it from different angles, as you probably know or have seen in the films. Here's me looking. I mean, honestly, I posed for this photo. I tried to smile, but I was, as I say, this is dedication. And here I'm in Sao Paulo, and this man's name is Paulo, and this is the Mac expert, certified Mac expert that I took it to yesterday. He took the back of the machine off, he looked at it and he went, not sure about this, not sure, could be bad. I've got to leave it with him for 5 days, and fingers crossed. So at the end of this webinar, I'm going to be launching a crowdfunding campaign let's buy Jamie a MacBook Pro. So I'm glad to see you all here. I'm not really, by the way. I'm not really. But if you want to send me some money, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send you my bank account, all right? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. But you know, you've got to be philosophical in these situations, haven't you? Anyway, enough of this. Enough of this. Let's get to the point. Let's start the webinar proper, shall we? That was the webinar proper. Um, some of you know me, some of you don't. And Bruno introduced me. He said I'm a teacher trainer and I'm a writer. And I've been sharing my ideas with teachers for over 10 years. And I've just worked out recently that I've worked in 43 different countries. I've worked with teachers in 43 different countries, and I don't really understand how that can possibly have happened. 43 different countries. And as somebody who's been sharing my ideas with teachers in 43 different countries, you know, I've become aware of these questions and these problems that teachers all over the world have, and they seem to be united by the same problems. And they're problems, you know, the kind of things that we're talking about here. They're universal problems we all have. How do I make my lessons more engaging? How do I motivate my students to talk? How do I find exciting lessons? And my answer these days is always the same. And you know what the answer is, don't you? It's always the same. It's two words. It's use story. And this really shouldn't surprise us, should it? You know it, that we as human beings are creatures of narrative. I mean, stories define us. We use stories to understand the world. We use stories to entertain ourselves. We use stories to persuade and stories to learn and stories to sell and stories to teach and stories to strengthen bonds with each other and stories to understand each other. We use story to communicate. I think storytelling is the quintessential 21st century skill. And you know, story and language are absolutely inseparable. And it makes me ask this question, what is it that stops us as teachers from using more story? And that's not a rhetorical question, by the way. I want to know your answers. What stops us, what stops you from using more story or storytelling in the classroom? And if you want me to define that, maybe I could refer to it as teacher-led storytelling. So the teacher is the one who initiates the storytelling, who manages the storytelling, is a storyteller, but tries to maintain some kind of interactive dynamic throughout. So lack of self-confidence and the curriculum and the need the methodology, limited with time, exam orientated. That's your question mark, teacher-led part. Sinem, could you elaborate that on your question mark, the teacher-led part? What could you elaborate what you mean by that? Now, when you say that you don't have time, this is a friend of mine. I've heard Susan Hilliard, maybe you know her, refer to that as every teacher's battle cry. I don't know if I completely understand what she means by that. But if you say you don't have time, then I'm going to come back at you and put it to you that you're seeing storytelling as something which should fill the class from the minute that you walk into it to the minute that you leave. And that's one image of video. Sorry, video. That's a different talk, different day. That's one image of story and storytelling. But stories can be short and sweet. If I was to say to you, do you use texts in the classroom? You'd all say yes. Could you imagine a teacher say, no, I don't use text in the classroom because I don't have the time? A story is a text. A text can be long, a text can be short. My story I started this webinar with about me spilling my coffee on my laptop. It could fill. Because of my experience, because I've been spending a lot of time over the years working on story and storytelling, developing my story and storytelling skills, I think I could probably make that fill a 30-minute or maybe a 45-minute time slot. I could alternatively make it short and sweet and snappy and use it as a way to introduce a topic. The topic may be one in the course book, maybe a topic on technology or things you've lost, things you've found. So if you say you don't have the time for storytelling, I think maybe you're seeing story and storytelling in a very specific way. So Elisa said you're not a performer. Your storytelling and your teacher talk is naturally low, which is, I think, a very nice thing to be. I think we all want to be able to reduce our teacher talk. I've stopped calling it teacher talk time because that defines it in terms of quantity, and I think we have to define it in terms of quality as well. So I refer to it just as teacher talk, as do many others. But reducing your teacher talk and cutting out the unnecessary teacher talk and becoming aware of your teacher talk is a great thing to do, and it's one of the first things we're told as teachers during training courses, and it's something that we aspire to be a sparse, or use our teacher talk in a sparse way. The school wants us to finish one section in 1 week and cover every single thing. That again is a time issue, isn't it? Elisa said again, you're not a great storyteller. Balanced teacher talk. How can we develop our storytelling skills? These are all great questions, and I've got answers for all of them. How effective is storytelling to improve the learner's language skills? How effective is it? That's a little bit, there's a question in English. Questions in English which are answered with other questions. And one of those questions, if you ask a question and the answer is how long is a piece of string, the implication is that it all depends on the approach. Because a story is a text, and it's a text which is delivered by a human being rather than a piece of paper. So how effective is it to use text in the classroom? So it all depends on your approach. Let me come back to some of these questions, and let me tell you a story. It's a story that I'm very, very fond of, and I want to tell this story to cover a few principles and illustrate a few ideas. How does that sound? I'm keeping an eye on all your comments. I can multitask. People say men can't. Well, here's one that can. So I can talk and keep an eye on your comments at the same time. So if I'm not answering your question, it possibly means I'm going to come back to it. One of the great questions that's been asked so far is how can you develop your storytelling skills? Let me tell you a story, and we'll come back to these later. This is a story. This is actually a true story. It's a true story about a fake story. And I wonder if any of you have heard this story before. If any of you were at the conference in London last week with Nick Bilborough's Hands Up. Was anyone at the Hands Up conference in London last week? That's a shame because it's a good conference, but on the other hand, you didn't hear the story, so that's good. This is a story, it's a true story about a fake story, and it involves a teacher called Mr. O. So once upon a time, there was a teacher called Mr. O, and Mr. O was a mathematics teacher, and Mr. O was the kind of teacher who loved to tell stories, and his students loved him for it. And one day, Mr. O was giving a geometry lesson, and he was required to draw a circle on the board. Now, do you know what mathematics teachers do or use when they draw circles on the blackboard? They use, and I know this because I used to be a student, and I know this now because my brother is a mathematics teacher. A string, yes, a string. So you need something to hold down the string to a certain point, and what's at the end of the other piece of string, Bruno? I know you know, I'm just concept checking the others, you know. You can use your tie. A marker, if it's a whiteboard, or if it's a blackboard, it's a piece of chalk, isn't it? You call that device a compass, or a pair of compasses, and sometimes you get ones which are specifically made for blackboards. They're oversized, they're big ones, and you like that. Now, I suppose in this day, and this is back in 1999, Mr. O was feeling a bit lazy, and so he decided to draw his circle freehand, like that. And it was a pretty good circle. And one of his students commented upon it. She said, "Hey, Mr. O, that's a pretty good circle." And Mr. O stepped back, looked at his work, and as quick as a flash, he said, "Of course it's a good circle. I am the world freehand circle drawing champion." And you know how you have some of those students that sit at the back of the class and they daydream? Well, this seemed to wake them up. And they said, "What? Our teacher, a world champion? Is this true? Is this true, Mr. O? Are you really the world freehand circle drawing champion?" And Mr. O said, "Yes, I am." They said, "Tell us the story." He improvised a story there on the spot. And a school legend was born. And news of Mr. O spread around the school, and he became famous in his school for being this world freehand circle drawing champion. And some afternoons, when Mr. O was left alone in his classroom, he'd pick up a piece of chalk and he'd practice his freehand circles on the blackboard, just in case someone should ask him again to demonstrate his skill. And they often did. Right, what do you think of being untruthful with your students? What do you think about this? How do you feel about it? Is this something that you do? Do you ever tell your students untruths? There's a great verb, and I'm not scared to use it, but I'm not going to use it because I might shock you. So that is the verb to BS. Do you know what that verb is, to BS? Who's brave enough to write it in the chat? It's being economical with the truth. You could call it lying, you could call it fibbing, you could call it fun. But I know that some teachers love it and other teachers feel very differently about it. Some teachers feel that MB's got it. Some teachers feel that it's there's a dynamic or responsibility that should not be of trust that should not be broken. I've worked with teachers who've said that. Personally, I love to BS my students. I've never completely been sure why. But let's go back. This was 1999 this happened, and 2 years later, 2001, Mr. O changed schools. And his new school was very close to his previous school, and naturally, I suppose, his story followed him. And his new students said, "Hey, we heard that you are a world champion. We heard that you can draw these freehand circles. Is it true?" And Mr. O said, "Yes, it is." And they said, "Demonstrate your skills." So he did. He showed them what he could do, and he told them his story. And this story, by the way, had evolved over the years. Mr. O had told it so many times that it was a great story. He could tell it within a minute and a half, and it became kind of consistent in the way he told it. But there was one student who was not convinced. a doubting Thomas. And he said, "You know what? I don't believe you. My mum teaches in your previous school. If you really were the world champion, freehand circle drawing champion, she would have told me." And Mr. O said, "Right, you go home tonight, you ask your mum and see what she says." And as soon as the school day was finished, Mr. O frantically got his phone and managed to get in touch with his old school, find that teacher, the student's mother, and explain his dilemma. Said, "Listen, I've told your son I'm the world champion freehand circle drawer. When he comes home tonight, he's going to ask you about it. Can you just say I was?" Now, this is an interesting point, isn't it? This is an interesting issue. What do you think this teacher does? Do you think she's going to put teacher camaraderie first? Or do you think she's going to put the relationship between herself and her son first? What do you think? Teacher first, or mother-son first? There's two questions here. The first question is, what do you think she does? I think a better question would be maybe, what would you do? What do you think is right? It depends if she's a storyteller. Teacher. I quite like what this teacher did, because when the son came home, he said, "We've got this new teacher, he's called Mr. O, he used to work in your school." And she says, "Oh yes, I remember." And he told us all that he's a world champion at drawing circles. And she says, "Ah, yes, it's absolutely true. It's true. He was very well known for it. Did I never tell you that? I'm surprised I never mentioned it before." So this student went back to school, told everyone that his mother, the teacher, had verified Mr. O's story, and Mr. O's story was re-established, this time in a new environment. There's definitely ethics to deconstruct here, aren't there? Which is why I love this story. A good story is always going to have points for discussion and deconstruction. A good story, when told well or when used well, can actually lead. It can be away from teacher talk, leading to student talk. There's lots of ways to try and get your students talking. One way that's often, or rather very rarely used, is getting students talk through teacher talk. I think in an attempt to keep our teacher talk down to an absolute minimum, we think that we've just got to get students to talk by magic, you know? So anyway, that was 2001. 2006, 5 years later, this story's not finished. One of Mr. O's students came to class, and he brought with him, do you remember these? A camcorder. Does anyone remember camcorders? This was in the day before mobile phones, or at least smartphones. Lots of your students, your teenage students, they'll probably remember them. Some of the younger ones may not. But you used to hold them like that. And this student brought a camcorder to school and said, "Mr. O, would you mind if I filmed you drawing a freehand circle on the blackboard?" And Mr. O said, "No problem at all." So the student said, "Can I do it now?" And Mr. O says, "Fine." So the student switched on the camcorder, pressed record, pointed it at Mr. O, and said, "Okay, I'm filming. Why don't you tell us the story first?" And Mr. O said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story." And he said, "This is something I used to do in my spare time. And then one day I discovered that there's actually a world championship that's held every year in Las Vegas. And in 1997, I entered this championship and I won. And now, as a previous winner, I automatically get invited back every year." And then he got ready to draw a circle. He picked up a piece of chalk He took a deep breath. And then, and to this day, that circle that he drew was probably the best freehand circle he's ever drawn in his life. And of course, it was all caught on camera. The video was put onto the school website. It went from outside the school. Mr. O's fame went beyond the local. It went from local to national, from national to international, from international to global. Mr. O found himself the subject of a viral video because this video went onto YouTube. It's the usual thing that happens, isn't it? Mr. O started to get calls from PR agents. He started to get calls and inquiries from people wanting to know more about this World Freehand Circle Drawing Championship. He got emails from long lost friends. He got invitations to appear on TV shows. Now, what would you do? You're all teachers. What would you do if you found this incidental fame? Would you try and cash in on it? Would you monetize it? Would you accept the offers to appear in daytime TV shows? Would you take advice from an expert PR agent? Would you tell the world, it was all a lie? Or would you continue with your story? You would travel to 43 countries and demonstrate your skill. Go on the road. 2014, or rather, actually before this, 2007 I should say, was probably the very first time I ever saw this video, the viral video, the one of Mr. O doing his stuff. And I actually used that video for the basis of a lesson on my website, Lesson Stream. And I think by the time the first time I used it, it had been viewed about 6 or 7 million times. And so I created this lesson plan around on Lesson Stream. But the thing is, and I'm being 100% truthful here, that I was not sold. I was suspicious that Mr. O's story was not real, that it wasn't authentic. And it's not because I'm particularly good at spotting a liar. It's not because I'm distrustful. It's just that he's a teacher. I'm a teacher. I like to lie to my own students. So I was just considering that perhaps he was doing the same. Maybe it takes one to know one. And so I decided to investigate, and I typed into Google, World Freehand Circle Drawing Championships. And my Google search took me to another video on YouTube, a second video. And the title of this video was World Freehand Circle Drawing Championship. And this video was a montage of the highlights of this event. And it seemed to be a knockout event. You'd get participants, contestants, they would go into pairs, they would draw one circle each, and the person who drew the best circle would go through the next round. And in the next round, or rather in the final round, who do I see in the final? Can you guess? There he was. I recognized him from the other video. It was Mr. O. And of all people, he was competing in the final against someone with a very interesting job, which also involves circles. Can you guess? It wasn't another mathematician. It wasn't another teacher. I'd love you to guess. What was that, Nuhad? The student, the mother. It wasn't the great lovely's ideas. It wasn't the student. It wasn't the mother. It was somebody else with a job involving circles. It was a ring maker. So a mathematics teacher competing against a ring maker in the final, and I couldn't believe it. I watched this video and thought it was true all along. This was not a lie. Now, Bruno mentioned my book. This book here, Video Telling and YouTube Stories for the Classroom. I wrote this in 2014, and I wanted to include this. I wanted to include this story in the book. This story about this Mr. O in the circle. It's exactly the kind of story I love. And the title of this book is YouTube Stories for the Classroom. So I contacted Mr. O through his school website. And I needed to ask him if he'd give me permission to use a transcript of his video, a transcript of the story that he told specifically. And he was very, very kind, and he said, no problem, I'd be very happy to do so. And we then started a bit of a chat on email, and I said to him, you know, it's funny because I suspected that your story was not completely true. I'm a teacher myself. I quite like to lie to my students. I'm not sure why I do it, but it's something I do. And I suspected that you were doing the same. And then Mr. O told me a secret. Unfortunately, he made me promise I wouldn't tell anyone. And so I'm in a dilemma now. Do I tell you the secret or not? I really don't know. I really don't know. Would you like me to tell you the secret? I'm just taking a moment here to read your comments. I love that idea. The man who paints the centre circle on a football pitch. What a great idea, MB. Okay, this is. I'm going to tell you the secret he told me. He said, Jamie, the second video, the World Freehand Circle Drawing Championship, this second video that you saw, I made it myself. Mr. O actually hired a venue. He hired judges. He found contestants. He got somebody to film it and somebody to edit it, somebody to put it on YouTube. He did this exactly 1 year after the original video went viral, you see, and he did it all to validate his story, and the whole thing worked perfectly, because most people, when they investigate something like this, they don't investigate it too hard, they don't subject it to too much scrutiny. And there I did it. It was exactly how it worked for me. I typed in World Freehand Circle Drawing Champion, I found this video on YouTube, I watched it and just, it was all, I can't believe it was true, but it wasn't, it was all and this is why Mr. O is my hero, because this is a man with total dedication to his story. He declined these offers to go on to chat shows and tell the stories that happened. He declined these offers for PR agents. He just thought, where can I take this story? And he did it in a very humble way. And that's why he's my hero. Is he yours? Now, the thing is about this, the reason, there's a second reason I like this story so much. And yes, you can see Mr. O on YouTube, but not yet. The reason I like this story so much is because one of the questions, or rather one of the answers that I get to that question, why would you not use storytelling in your classroom? One of the answers that comes up is because it's teacher-centered. It's too teacher-centered. The dynamic of the teacher-led storytelling is teacher-centered. I think we would all agree that Mr. O, whose real name, by the way, is Alexander YLTSIG. I call him Mr. O because I like that. His name begins with O. And YLTSIG is a difficult Polish name to pronounce. And we have to agree, he was always at the centre of his story. He was at the heart of his story. Therefore, by definition, his story was teacher-centred. The problem with the term teacher-centredness is it's not a neutral term. People use teacher-centred often with a negative connotation. And that's why it's a term that I always like to avoid when possible. The terms teacher-centeredness and student-centeredness, one of them is very negative, one of them is very positive. And so I try and avoid them. And the reason I wouldn't want to call Mr. O's story teacher-centered, although mathematically it is teacher-centered in that he's at the centre of it, the reason I wouldn't, because I think we can all appreciate the value in this story. We can, can't we? What is the value? And I'll give you some ideas for what the value is. Number one, think of the sense of community that Mr. O created in his school, in his classroom, through that story. The sense of community. Number two, just think about how engaged his students were in his classroom. And also, imagine how motivated they were to learn about the circleometer. I haven't mentioned the circleometer. The circleometer is a fictitious, imaginary device. Mr. O invented it, that judges use to measure circles. The judges use the circleometer to measure the freehand circles in this championship, and the mathematics of it are actually quite complicated, and that is one of Mr. O's favourite lessons in his maths classroom. So, and for language teachers, our job, no matter what your view of language teaching is, no matter what you subscribe to, I think we can probably all agree that our job is to immerse our students in meaningful language and provide them with opportunities to converse with each other and with the teacher. Now, story and storytelling makes all of that possible. As teachers, we all need to create community in our classroom. As teachers, we all need to engage our students. As language teachers, we all need to immerse our students in meaningful language and provide them with opportunities for communication between themselves and with the teacher. And let's not forget that Mr. O's story, although he managed it, although he initiated it, it would never have existed without his curious students, without those questions from his students. In a sense, the narrative, the story itself, was driven by his students. He was just reacting. And although that story I've just told you has lasted a good 30 minutes, Mr. O could tell his story in 60 seconds. Again, it's not, we don't have to see teacher-led storytelling as being a long process, time-consuming. It can be quick, and it can be short, and it can be sweet. How do you feel about that? Anything to ask? Elisa's already been Googling it. I'm not going to put in the link, but go and find it later. All you need to do is go to YouTube and type in World Freehand Circle and go through some of the videos that you see. You'll see Alexander first. He'll come up first, and if you've got my book, you'll find the link. Also, so anything to say or anything to ask? Any questions? If there are no questions, then there can be no answers. That's kind of wise, isn't it, for this time in the morning? Now, a couple of questions that have been asked here. Whoops. I lost you for a moment. Enjoy storytelling inside the classroom. How can you do this if you're introducing an article or a speech? Okay, this is a huge topic. When you're talking about an article, one of when, on my storytelling courses, one of the things I encourage teachers to do is that every single artifact, every single piece of material that you take into the classroom has a story behind it. If I'm going to relate this back to the previous story, the artifact is a video on YouTube. There's a story behind it, and did you notice how I was actually a part of that story? If you have an article to use in the classroom, your story could be as simple as how you came to find it. And this is a very important part of setting the context, because as teachers, are we just going to go into the classroom and give out an article? When you become aware of the importance of story, you would always use the story of the article. For example, if I go into the classroom and I'm going to tell my students, how was your weekend? I was with my sister at the weekend, and she showed me this article that she read. It was about this, and she said this, and I thought that, and I wasn't sure about it. Then she gave me this article to read. I was really kind of surprised by this. Would you like to see it? Now that's using storytelling. That's becoming aware of your narrative within the materials. And those tiny differences can personalize your course book, can personalize the materials, can make students more motivated to read the articles. Does that make sense? More questions here. More tips. Okay, how do you improve your storytelling skills is something that you've asked before. And I said we would come back to this. Now, I think it's important to realize that we are all storytellers. We all have stories to share. We all have stories to tell. Some teachers have got this idea that you either have it or you don't. There are as many ways to tell a story as there are human beings on the planet. And one thing that I am absolutely convinced at is that we can all improve. And I think that maybe a part of the resistance to this is because sometimes teachers don't know how to improve. They focus on the delivery. They focus on eye contact. They focus on charisma. They focus on the type of storyteller who maybe is that charismatic performer, the one that engages the students, draws them in. And that's maybe what I'm doing today, because I'm being more of a performer right now on this webinar. But it depends which storyteller's hat I'm wearing. When you look at teacher-led storytelling, that's only one of many dynamics. We can see storytelling or teacher-led storytelling as being telling your students a very short story to start a topic. We can see it as almost being something that's very interactive and becoming conversational. We can use the story as the text. If the text is a narrative, we can just read out. We can use, if you're using texts which are narratives, I tend to like to read the text first and then give it out. And as I'm reading it, I'll stop to ask questions. And that way students get the text twice. There's also many different ways to see storytelling, and to improve storytelling, you've got to realize that a big part of it is not just about delivery, but it's about planning and it's about reflection. Is there anybody here in this webinar who has never shared with their students a personal anecdote? I'm going to guess that every one of you does it regularly, because quite frankly, you are all human beings. And now, usually, I'm going to guess that when you share an anecdote with your students, it just comes up. You probably didn't plan to go into your classroom and share an anecdote with them. Am I right? It just came up. But when you did it, did you ever take a moment afterwards, at the end of the class, to reflect upon it and think, How well did I tell that story? Could I have told it better? Could I have maybe graded my language better? Are there questions that I could have asked my students, maybe before, during, or after? Could I have used it better, maybe to elicit stories from my students? There's all sorts of questions that we can ask ourselves. And so the first thing you've got to do if you want to improve your storytelling skills is to understand the importance of reflection. And then you can go further than that, because not just reflecting on stories that you've told spontaneously or improvised, but then deciding, choosing that you're going to tell a story in the classroom and taking some time to actually plan and prepare it. Think about the text. Think about the language choices you're going to use. Think about the questions you can ask your students. Think about keeping it short and sweet. Think, maybe I could even use the text. Nobody ever said you have to do it from memory, but communicate with your students. That's a skill. And always, let's remember that it's this, a lot of teachers say it's the students who should be the ones that are telling the stories, and I absolutely agree. But we have to be leading by example. If this is the quintessential 21st century skill, students have got to see a good model storyteller, and that's you. And a good storyteller will acknowledge that the stories come from the audience, and you'll be setting up tasks. Do you know, is anyone here into chat shows? I've always been quite interested in the parallel between chat shows and conducting conversation classes. And I think probably the best known chat show host, current chat show host in the United Kingdom right now is an Irish comedian presenter called Graham Norton. So on Graham Norton's chat show, it's a television program. He gets famous guests. They appear on his show. He asks them questions. He gets them to talk. He gets them to interact. It's a little bit like a conversation class, isn't it? Except that he's got a huge big audience and it's got to be entertaining. Maybe unlike a standard conversation classes, the ones that I've taught in any case. And so some of you know who Graham Norton is. Some of you have never heard of him, but he's a very famous celebrity, and he's experienced. He's got over 20 years experience. And I watched a program recently in which he revealed some of his secrets. It was called Graham Norton's Golden Guest Secrets, and how he manages his guests and how he gets them talking. And he had one single golden rule, and I bet you can't guess what his golden rule was. Graham Norton's one single golden rule for his guests. I'm not going to tell you until I see someone try and guess what it is. I'm going to tell you, because I know you want to know, and it's nearly time to finish. It's actually kind of simple. Graham Norton's telling funny stories, that's close enough. Graham Norton's golden rule for every single guest who appears on his show, who has ever appealed, you don't appeal on a show, you do appeal on a show, but in this case has ever appeared on his show, 3 words: bring a story. Bring a story. Now, take this seriously. When you go back to your classrooms on Monday morning, instead of saying to your students, what did you do at the weekend? Ask them to share their weekend story. Insist that no matter how uneventful their weekend was, everybody has a weekend story. It's just that it's quite difficult to identify it. This is about story awareness, identifying your story. My weekend story is obviously spilling coffee on my laptop. I'm not going to be in the classroom on Monday morning, but if I was, I would definitely be using that to start off my class. Monday mornings are so valuable for teachers. So get the ball rolling by you demonstrating the importance of and the possibility for everybody to have a weekend story, short and sweet. Try and get your students into the same mindset. Set them as homework on Friday night. All you have to do on Monday is bring in your weekend story and take it seriously. And also, if nobody's got a weekend story to share, you could maybe give them a license to learn.
Yes, yeah. Thank you
If the
so
teacher's
much,
going to do it,
Jamie,
why
for
not the
such a
students?
great webinar.
Right, I believe it's
It was
almost
a
time to
lovely
finish. I've been keeping
story that
an eye
you
on your
told us,
question.
and it was
Just
very nice
two
to
things
see
to
how we
say.
can
Bruno
get into
mentioned
more
my
storytelling in our
Sunday posts.
daily practices, right?
This is my
So
Sunday post.
I hope you
Every
enjoyed
Sunday I send
today's
out a story
Young Learners and
or a
Teens
storytelling
webinar as much
idea
as we
to
did.
about
I'd like
8,000
also to tell you about two
teachers.
other
Some of
super
you I know are
upcoming
already
events
subscribed.
that the
If
SIG
you'd
is
like to
supporting.
subscribe,
The
it's
first
very
one is the
simple. All you have to do is go to my website
YLT Malta
and
conference,
subscribe,
which
and I'm
will
going to
happen
drop the
in
link in
October
right now.
from the 12th to
And
the
there
13th.
it is, there's a subscription.
And
Number two,
in which we will
this is
include a
big
strand
news. This is the
organized
biggest
in
news of
collaboration
my
with
day.
the Young Learners and Teens SIG.
This is coming
This strand
soon.
is
It's
goal
Jamie
is to
Keddie's
move
online
beyond
story
a catch-all
course.
approach in
And
ELT
this is,
and to foster
hand in my heart,
age-appropriate
the
pedagogy
best
according
thing
to
I'm ever going to
children's
publish.
ages and lifestyles. So if you're interested in speaking in this
I'll be
strand, please
keeping all
submit a
of my
proposal
subscribers
focused on one
informed. So if
specific
you're on my
age range,
mailing list, on my
early
Sunday
years or
post list,
primary
I'll
or
be
lower
telling you
secondary
everything. So that's all
or
you need to do
upper
is subscribe
secondary.
to.
So if
Bruno
your
just
proposal
wrote
is
in
considered sufficiently
jamiekeddies.com, but it's actually
age-appropriate, it will be included
jamiekeddy.com.
in the
Because
strand.
Bruno, there's
And
only one
please
Jamie
note that
Keddie.
the deadline is April 30th and apply via the YLT Malta website. The second event
So I think Bruno's going to come over and take over and
that
moderate me
IATEFL
here
Global
and
Issue
take over the
SIG
ship.
is doing
Bruno, thank
together
you very
with
much for having
the
me,
young
and thank you very
learners
much
to
to all these
deliver Africa
participants
TISO's
for being
inaugural
here
PCE in
and your
Dakar,
interaction. It's
Senegal
been fun.
on
Have
May
you
the
had fun,
4th.
Bruno?
And the theme is Africa in the World in Africa, Quality Secondary English Language Education for Local and Global Understanding. You can find out more and register via the Africa TISO website. We'd also like to thank our delivery partner YLT Consultants for sponsoring the Young Learners and Teens SIG talks and workshops at the Africa TISO PCE. So thank you very much for attending today's webinar and supporting the SIG. I'll see you very, very soon with more details and more events that the SIG will be holding for you. So thank you very much, and I'll see you. Bye, everyone. Bye, Jamie. Thank you.